Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to do a video that I had sort of been thinking about doing for a while, and then I received a comment that asked for something similar, and it just sort of seemed like a sign from the universe. So we're going to talk through 13 books that I recommend for people who are seeking or interested in Gardnerian witchcraft. And I suppose this also extends to Alexandrian witchcraft. The two traditions are very similar. But these are books covering sort of a range of subjects from ritual and theology to some of the more sort of nitty-gritty aspects of history and sort of understanding how modern Wicca came into existence. This is the list, this is the actual list of recommended reading that I give to seekers who are training with me. Um, these are all books that I do genuinely recommend, and I think there is great value in reading all of them. Some of them are a little out of date and need some sort of contextualization and critical reading skills, and we can talk through that as we discuss the list. But these are all books that I actually give to people who are training with me. This is not a comprehensive book list, right? These are not the only books that someone could or should read in order to learn valuable things that would help them in seeking Gardnerian Wicca. There are also some people who might disagree with some of the choices that I've put on here, and feel that some books are more or less valuable, right? Like every coven is different, you know, every group that you train with is going to train a little bit differently. Some might not even have a recommended reading list. It's also important to note right out the gate that reading books is not the only or even the most important way to learn about Wicca, right? Wicca is an experiential religion. A lot of it is in what you do, in what you experience, in the personal experiences that you have in ritual or in meditation or with the gods. And also, right, there are other forms of media out there. There are documentaries, there are YouTube videos, there are many different ways to learn about Wicca, other than just reading books. So reading books is a very sort of traditional, kind of academically oriented way of learning Wicca, and because I am who I am, I like that way of learning Wicca. But it's not the only way, it's not the most important way necessarily, so just sort of keep that in mind, that I'm not saying these are books that you have to read in order to be a Gardnerian seeker. These are just texts that I find helpful and that I generally recommend. We're going to go through them in alphabetical order by author, so no particular priority of importance. And our first one here is Drawing Down the Moon by Margot Adler. Margot Adler, for those of you who don't know, was a Gardnerian priestess. She was also a radio journalist, and she wrote this book basically sort of documenting her journey across America, interviewing and trying to understand pagans, witches, druids of all sorts of paths, and people from sort of Gardnerian Wicca, Alexandrian Wicca, as well as more sort of unabashedly new pagan movements. She talks about things like the Church of All Worlds, Green Egg Magazine, and so there's a lot of, for one thing, just really good pagan history in here. I think if you want to understand the development of paganism in the US in the back half of the 20th century, this is a really essential book to read to understand who the major figures were, right? Who Morning Glory's El Ravenheart was, and how she affected the general pagan community, things like that. But also there are some commentaries on sort of the pagan worldview. She has some really good interviews with practicing pagans from a variety of perspectives, and so it gives a good view of pagan theology and things like that, as well as some personal anecdotes of her own from her journeys. My favorite story in this book is that she showed up for a training, to guest at a circle with Maxine Sanders' Coven, and was told on the day that she showed up, with no prior warning, that they were doing an initiation that night, and that she was expected to be the high priestess of that initiation, even though she wasn't an initiate of the Alexandrian tradition. It's a great story. So anyways, highly recommend this book. And yeah, that's book number one. Book number two, I don't have a copy of with me because I read it as a library book, which also brings up sort of an important point. Books are expensive, books can be hard to get. Keep in mind that at least some of these books are likely going to be available to you through a public library system. If you can't get them through your public library, you might be able to get them through interlibrary loan. And failing that, a lot of them are going to be available as ebooks as well. So just, we live in a wonderful era where information is highly accessible, and that's a good thing. So the second book that I recommend is called Rites and Symbols of Initiation by Mircea Eliade. And hang on, I'm just Googling it right now because I don't remember when it was published. It was published in 1958. So Eliade, for those of you who don't know, was an anthropologist. He's sort of a founding figure, well, not founding, right? Anthropology started in the 19th century, but he's a very influential figure in mid-20th century anthropology. There are things about him that are now out of favor, right? He definitely has this sort of vaguely social Darwinist perspective where he works a lot with Aboriginal and Indigenous tribes, and he definitely talks about them as primitive. Right there, he also tries to draw universal conclusions from particular observations in a way that is no longer, really favored as an anthropological method. But all of that sort of said, having that context put out there, Rites and Symbols of Initiation is a really wonderful book because it talks about what initiation is and what initiation is for. And it doesn't do that from a Wiccan perspective, right? Eliade was not Wiccan, to the best of my knowledge, didn't know that Wicca existed. He's writing about initiation in indigenous tribes, and largely he's writing about puberty rites. But he talks about the general structure of initiation, right? So you have someone being separated from society, consecrated to death. They undergo an ordeal which leads them to a symbolic death and rebirth, at which point they are given a new identity as a member of the adult society, or the inner society. And new lore is revealed to them, whether that's particular mythology or ritual techniques or whatever, and then they're reintegrated into society. And I think that framework is a really good way for seekers who are on the outside of initiation and don't know what an initiatory Wiccan experience is like, to get sort of an understanding of what sort of thing they might be able to expect from initiation, what purpose initiation serves, why initiation might be a thing worth pursuing, and just sort of understanding from a big picture perspective what the concept of initiation is about. And I think that's a valuable thing for seekers, right? It's something that initiates talk about amongst themselves quite a lot, but we have difficulty talking about it with seekers because, right, we have oaths to keep, and we're not going to discuss sort of the actual details of a Gardnerian initiation, but we can talk, I think, about initiation more broadly in ways that are really beneficial for a seeker. Recommendations number 3 and 4 are The Witch's Goddess and The Witch's God by Janet and Stewart Farrar. I love these books. These books are a little out of date. They're a lot out of date. These books are imperfect, but they're the best thing that's on the market right now as far as theology that discusses the Wiccan gods. There is a fair amount of history that has now been debunked, and some gender essentialism in both of these books, right? They were written in the 80s, and they weren't written with sort of a modern perspective, modern understanding of Wiccan history, right? Triumph of the Moon had not yet come out. There were a lot of people who really genuinely believed that Wicca was an ancient religion, and that's the perspective from which these books are written. And there's also a certain amount of, like, the goddess is the womb and makes babies, and that is what womanhood is, which obviously we are now sort of as a society in a place where we have a much more nuanced, less essentialist understanding of gender that is also not pinned to biology. But that said, these books have a lot of really good information if you're able to sort of read critically past those flaws. Each book is divided into 3 parts. The first part has chapters on sort of the general theology of either the goddess or the god. So just taking from The Witch's Goddess, there are chapters like the Earth Mother, the Bright and Dark Mother, Psyche and Goddess, Woman as Goddess, the Grail as a symbol of the goddess. And so those are sort of good, big picture, abstract discussions of who the goddess is. Part 2 of each book includes a sampling of particular deities and how they might be sort of worshipped and invoked in the context of a Wiccan ritual. So this is a little bit more eclectic, right? This is not referring to 2 specific deities as patrons of the craft, but rather to various deities who might be invoked and worshipped in a Wiccan context. and the Farrars provide a ritual for each of those deities. So here we have Demeter and Persephone, and then you also have Breed in here, Ishtar, Aphrodite, Hecate, and so on. And a lot of the Farrars' rituals are a little too talky for my taste. They involve a lot of lines and a lot of saying things and describing the myth and maybe a little bit of ritual drama. My personal taste, I tend to lean toward more sort of ecstatically embodied ritual. That's what I get the most out of in ritual. So I don't really use the rituals that are in these books, but nonetheless, I think they're sort of good examples of um, goddess worship or god worship sort of in the bigger picture, and then sort of in the smaller picture, the way that those principles can be applied to the worship of particular deities. And the third part of each book is an index with just a listing of deity names from all around the world, with a short description of who they are and what their mythology is and things like that. So that's also, I think, useful just for people who are looking for a starting point in discovering pagan mythology from around the world. So, book number 5 is The Sea Priestess by Dion Fortune. This is a wonderful book. I'm actually involved in a book club right now, where I'm rereading The Sea Priestess and talking about it. Dion Fortune's writing is a little bit slow, but this is by far her most accessible book, and holy crap, that ritual. So for those of you who don't know, the basic premise of this book is that there's a man, he's a realtor in a small town in, bumfuck England, and a mysterious woman named Vivian Le Fay Morgan, or Morgan Le Fay, if you will, moves into town, buys an abandoned property on the seafront, and starts to set it up as a sea temple so that she can perform a pagan ritual to the goddess Isis. And this man gets involved with her rituals, and they end up doing this sort of big magical lunar working at the end of the book, and it just like knocks the top of your head off. It's incredible. This is also, right, a fictionalized telling of a lot of the metaphysical principles that Dion Fortune talks about in some of her nonfiction books, and she says explicitly, like, the nonfiction books give you the theory, and then the fiction gives you a sense of how that theory gets implemented. And so there's a whole lot of occult symbolism riddled throughout here. There's a lot of Kabbalistic symbolism, but there's also just sort of this very deep pagan yearning for the goddess, right? Dion Fortune spent her whole career swinging back and forth between being pagan and being Christian. And The Sea Priestess was written at the height of her pagan phase. And it feels like my goddess. When I read this book, when I read sort of the invocation of Isis that's performed in this book, and the description of who she is and how she relates to the world, it feels like she's talking about my goddess. And so this feels like a really good way for seekers to sort of get a sense of who the goddess is, get involved in sort of magic and paganism and theology more broadly, in a way that's kind of accessible, and also, like, it's a novel, it's fun. So, highly recommend it. Caveat lector, Dion Fortune was a white woman writing in the 1930s. She's fairly casually racist. She's fairly casually homophobic. I wish that weren't the case. I think that there's still enough good stuff in the book that it's worth reading despite that. But, reader beware. Books number 6 and 7 on my list. Gosh, this is going to be a long video. I'm sorry about that. But I think this is important. I gotta say. Books number 6 and 7 on my list are books about Wiccan history. So, going in alphabetical order by author, first we have Philip Heselton. You can sort of read any of Heselton's books. A lot of the information cross-pollinates. The one that I recommend is his most recent one, In Search of the New Forest Coven, where he, is trying to identify who belonged to the New Forest Coven, how they might have gotten involved, how they conceived of what they were doing, because we know that, whatever they were doing is not exactly the same as the Wicca that we know today. And so, what did they think they were doing? Did they consider it witchcraft? How did they conceive of their relationships to each other? Things like that. And it's a good book. It's worth reading. I feel the need to point out that Philip Heselton is not an academic historian, and he does not hold himself to the same burden of proof that an academic historian would. So, right, the thing about Triumph of the Moon, which we'll get to in a second, is that Hutton is an academic and he will not make any claim unless he has 7 different sources to back it up. Philip Heselton does not do that. Philip Heselton is perfectly okay with speculation, and he has a tick that I, as an academic, don't love, where he will speculate about something in chapter 2 and say, maybe this was the case, and then, 100 pages later in chapter 7, he'll say, as we proved in chapter 2, blah, 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 blah. So you have to read this book with a critical eye, understand that there is a lot of rampant speculation going on, and, take the claims here with a grain of salt. That said, it's still a good book, and it's still worth reading because he's done some really interesting archival research. He's gone out and found, biographies of people who genuinely were involved with the Crotona Fellowship and very plausibly might have been part of the New Forest Coven. There's good information in here. You just have to be careful about reading it and don't be too credulous. So, there's that. The next book, like I said, is Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. This is such an important book, and it's such a good book, too. It's dense, it's difficult, right? This is an academic text. It's full of footnotes and careful research. It's probably, sort of looking through my books, it's probably the hardest book on my recommended reading list. Well, no, Rites and Symbols of Initiation is a difficult read. But anyways, take your time with it. Go slowly. Remember that you're not reading this for an academic class. You can read it as slowly as you want. You can reread it if you want to. You don't have to absorb all of the information. You're not going to be tested on it. But Ronald Hutton does a really good job of talking about the various influences that converged at the end of the 19th century and through the middle of the 20th century to allow for the rise of Wicca. And these influences include things like, literary romanticism. So he talks a lot about the conceptions of the goddess Diana and the god Pan in romantic poetry, and how these things came to influence the sort of 20th century pagan revival with their understanding of who the goddess and the god were. He talks about the influence of magical orders like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley's OTO. He talks about the influence of Dion Fortune. He talks about Freemasonry. And all of these things are things that had an influence on the development of Wicca, right? And then he also talks a little bit about sort of the biography of some major Wiccan figures. He talks about Gardner and Valiente and their falling out. He talks about the rise of Robert Cochrane and sort of traditional witchcraft. He talks about Alex Saunders, Sanders, I think it's Sanders. Anyways, and then he talks about, Starhawk and the development, the proliferation of non-initiatory forms of Wicca in the United States. Reclaiming witchcraft involves initiations of a kind, but it's very different from lineaged Gardnerian Wicca. Anyways, you get the point. It's a history of Wicca, and it's so important to know that history. In part because, right, people are still to this day saying, oh, Wiccans believe that Wicca was an ancient religion, when in fact it was all made up in 1939 by Gerald Gardner. And, we have the history. We know the history, and the history is beautiful. And I think it's important and valuable to have that under our belts. Some Wiccans dislike Hutton. I am not one of them, but I will sort of speak on behalf of them. Some Wiccans who really deeply believe that Wicca is an ancient witch cult that had survived and predates the New Forest Coven dislike Hutton because they feel like Hutton is saying Gardner made it all up. That is not what Hutton is saying. Hutton is saying these are the influences that came together at this particular moment in history to allow for this specific kind of pagan witchcraft to emerge in the world. And that is certainly true, right? So Gardnerian Wicca is influenced by James Frazer's The Golden Bough, Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe. Right? I have a whole video about source texts for witchcraft. I can link that down below, so you can go watch that if you like. But there are 19th and 20th century texts that influenced Wicca, and we know that. There are, magical orders like the Golden Dawn and like, Freemasonry. Debatable whether we can call that a magical order, but secret societies like Freemasonry that had an influence on Wicca. And those are the things that Hutton is pushing to the fore here. And then talking about things like the influence of literary romanticism, the figure of the god Pan in, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn is the chapter in The Wind in the Willows that has sort of this depiction of the horned god, very similar to how a lot of pagans talk about him. And those are all things that influenced Wicca, that allowed Wicca to come into the world. Hutton is agnostic on the question of whether there was an ancient witch cult. If I had to guess at the interior of Ronald Hutton's mind, I would guess that he probably doesn't believe in that. I certainly probably don't believe in that. But he's just, right, he's an outsider as an academic historian saying, look, here are the things that allowed this kind of witchcraft to come into the world. And so even if we believe that there was an ancient witch cult that predated the New Forest Coven, which some people do still believe, this book is not trying to discredit that. This book is trying to say, whatever Gerald Gardner got, and wherever he got it from, here are the other things that came together in the 20th century that compounded on top of that to create this very specific thing that is Gardnerian Wicca. So it's a really wonderful book. Highly recommend it. Please, please read. I've lost track of how many books we've gone through. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we're on book number 8. The Elements of Ritual by Deborah Lipp. This is a must-read. Admittedly, I'm biased, right? Deborah is my high priestess, so I am biased because the way I was trained in Gardnerian ritual and in Wiccan ritual in general is the way that Deborah teaches it, which is also the way that she writes about it. So I read this book and I'm like, yes, this is everything about Wicca. This is all correct. This is, A+. Different priestesses train differently, so keep in mind that there are going to be some things in here that may be a little bit different from one group to another, right? This isn't a blueprint for how all Gardnerian groups are going to do their outer court training rituals. Some Gardnerian groups don't even do outer court rituals. But it's a really good roadmap to understanding the underlying structure of Wiccan ritual, the underlying theology of Wiccan ritual, right? So the sort of selling point on this is like, everyone knows how to cast a circle, but no one tells you why. And the idea here is like, let's work through, why do you cast a circle? What is the symbolism of that? What is the point of casting a circle, right? Why do you call the quarters? What's the deal with the elements? How do they converge? And so on, right? Like, what's going on with invoking the gods? How do you do that? Why do you do that? When do you do that? And so on and so forth. It's a really wonderful book. Couldn't recommend it highly enough. A+. My next book is also by Deborah. Once again, I'm biased because I was trained by Deborah. This is Magical Power for Beginners, and this is the only book on my list of 13 books that's about how to do magic. A lot of seekers come to Gardnerian craft already with some amount of experience in doing magic under their belts, right? They have techniques and ways that they like to do their spellcraft. So I don't overemphasize the magic, also because I think, right, particularly in training seekers, I think the more important thing to focus on is the religion. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, in Wicca, the magic and the religion are one and the same. Every magical act is religious, and every religious act is magical. But I think it's more important to push sort of the religious aspect of things, in part because that weeds out the people who aren't really there for the Wicca and who just want to learn magic, right? If you're not interested in the gods and you just want to learn how to do magic, there are other ways to do that besides Wicca. But I think a little bit of magic is important because Wicca is a form of witchcraft. We do witchcraft. Witchcraft is what we're about, and you gotta know how to do spells. So a lot of that training I do sort of outside of reading. I do that, in person. It's easier to demonstrate and just do things with people. But I really like this book as sort of a 101 primer on magic. It's also, I think, very good for experienced practitioners. This is the technique that I was trained in for how to do magic. There were other techniques for spell work that are also effective, but this is how I was trained, and this is how I train. And the idea here, right, is that magic is a process where you sort of decide what you want, you set your goal, and then you figure out what your target is going to be, right? So your goal is what you want to accomplish. Your target is the thing that you're aiming at with your magic to try to make that happen. You focus your intent, you establish a sympathetic link, you raise power in an appropriate way, and you send power. And, like, that's the model for the kind of magic that I do. The spells that I perform, that's how I do them. And this walks through how to do those sorts of spells. It includes sample spells, it breaks down the structure of a spell and takes a couple of sample spells and looks at step by step what are you doing at each stage. It talks through, you know, magical tools and things like the importance of transcending time and space in order to accomplish magic and why that's important. Right, I think it's just a really good book about magic. I think that anyone who's interested in magic can benefit from this. There are other very good books about magic out there. I'm not saying don't read those. They'll present sort of a different framework for magic, a different theoretical understanding of magic. It's beneficial to have a plurality of perspectives and to try different techniques and see what works for you. But this is the only magic book that I have on my reading list because this is the way that I do magic. And also, once again, right, like Deborah is my high priestess. It's unsurprising that this is the way that I do magic because this is how she taught me. So, my next book on the list is Traditional Wicca, A Seeker's Guide by Thorn Mooney. Thorn is great. She is a Gardnerian high priestess, and she has another book coming out later this year. It's called The Witch's Path. You should all go pre-order it because it's going to be great. But this one is about sort of what is traditional Wicca, why bother with traditional Wicca, what makes traditional Wicca different from other kinds of Wicca, right? This sort of solitary and eclectic forms of Wicca. And if you're interested in traditional Wicca, how do you go about finding a coven? How do you go about seeking it? There's no actual Wicca in this Wicca book. There are no rituals. There's no magic. But it's just talking about, like, what is this thing that is traditional Wicca, and why do I care? She, I think, gives a really good understanding of what Wicca is, what traditional Wicca is. Sorry, gotta be careful there. She has sort of 5 definitional points that she gives for it, where she says, let's see if I can do this off the top of my head. Traditional Wicca is lineaged, hierarchical, initiatory, coven-based, and experiential. I think I got those out of order. But she says, like, those are the 5 features that define traditional Wicca. And so she's taking a very broad perspective on traditional Wicca. She's not trying to say which traditions do and do not count. But, like, those are the things that define traditional Wicca. And she talks through sort of the pros and cons of each of those things and says, like, look, if these are things that are appealing to you, traditional Wicca is probably going to be interesting. If these are things that sound horrible to you, traditional Wicca is probably not going to be interesting. And then at the end, she talks about, you know, as a seeker, how do you look for a coven? How do you approach a coven? How do you write a seeker letter? And those are, I think, really good, valuable skills. So there's nothing else like this book. It's stunning, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to all seekers of not just Gardnerian Wicca, but any kind of traditional witchcraft. Traditional Wicca, I'm sorry. I do not believe that Wicca is the only legitimate form of witchcraft, but because the witchcraft circles I move in are mostly Wiccan, I'm in the habit of using the 2 terms interchangeably. That is not to say that I think they should be used interchangeably, it's just sort of a linguistic tick. Oh boy, there's so many books, so many books. We have 3 more books to go. I know this is a long video, guys, but I think it's worth it. I think it's important. These are really good books, and I want to recommend them all. The next one is actually a book that I only read very recently, but I loved it so much that I immediately put it on my reading list. And this is Transportation by Diana Paxson. Sorry, there's a little bit of glare. This is a book about just the foundational skills of meditation, path working, you know, astral journeying, transpossession, any kind of meditative ritual work that you're going to do in the course of a magical, religious, devotional practice. The foundational skills for that are covered in this book. And I think those are really important skills, and really just sort of laying the groundwork, right? Anytime you talk about any intro Wicca book, or you go on a message board or Reddit or whatever, you're going to get the advice, well, you need to start meditating. And it's annoying advice, especially when it's coming from people who are like, oh, yes, I meditate for 2 hours every day. Because apparently those people don't have other things to do with their time. Anyways, I'm sorry. If you meditate for 2 hours a day, wonderful for you. I meditate 20 minutes a week. Um, but regardless, right? Like meditation, as annoying as that advice can be, meditation is actually really important and foundational to magical practice. And this book goes through and talks about why it's important, gives you some really good starting exercises for it, talks through sort of not just the basics, but also some more complicated techniques like finding, astral spirits that you can connect to, that can serve as guides to you on the inner planes. Talks about, working with sort of different maps of the immaterial planes and the way that you can use those as a guide for meditation, things like that. It talks a little bit about like transpossession and oracular divination, things like that. I keep saying things like that. It's a tick. Anyway, moving on. It's a wonderful book, and it covers the ground of a lot of really important skills that will be incredibly beneficial to you in any kind of magic or ritual setting. So, highly recommend this book. The penultimate book recommendation is The Spiral Dance by Starhawk. Starhawk, very much not a Gardnerian. The way that she writes, the kind of witchcraft that she practices, is almost antithetical to Gardnerian Wicca, right? It's eclectic, it's non-hierarchical, they do something different every time. But I think this is a really important book for a couple of reasons. One is sort of for the same reasons that I talked about Drawing Down the Moon. These two books were published in the same year, and they cover a lot of ground for understanding Wicca and witchcraft and paganism in the 20th century. And I think that history is important. Starhawk was it's strongly influenced by fairy witchcraft, which is, right, Victor Anderson fairy tradition is a non-Wiccan form of witchcraft that emerged sort of totally independent of Wicca. But there are also, just general principles in here. She talks about paganism and a pagan worldview and what that means and the way it relates to ecology and the earth and feminism and other sorts of things that I think are useful and informative, even if you're not attracted to the kind of witchcraft that Starhawk practices. There are really good exercises in this book, really good meditations, sample quarter calls. The chapters on the goddess and the god are very good. The other reason I recommend this book is specifically for the 20th anniversary edition. If you're going to read The Spiral Dance, please, please, please read the 20th anniversary edition, because it has all these notes sort of scattered through it where Starhawk went through 10 years after initial publication and then again 20 years after initial publication and updated the book and said, my views about things have changed over time. In particular, the first edition of The Spiral Dance is very gender essentialist. It's a lot of like woman's power comes from the womb, etc., etc., etc. And Starhawk changed her views with time and went back and said, as my understanding of gender has gotten more nuanced, I've thought that this really isn't the way to approach this. And let me tell you about how I'm thinking of things now. And I think that's so important. For one thing, because like we should all be doing that. We should all be updating our views with time. And I think to take such a monumental figure in the pagan world as Starhawk and see the way that she does that is a really stellar example. But secondly, because people still have this idea that Wicca or Wiccan flavored paganism is stuck in these gender essentialist ideas of woman equals vagina, man equals penis, woman is mother, and all women are mothers, and if a woman is childless, then she is an insufficient woman because she must be making babies because the goddess is a mother. And no, that's what the landscape of Wicca looked like in the late 70s and early 80s, and over time that has changed, right? There are still clingers on. There's still turfism in Wicca. Z Budapest is still strongly anti-trans. But Wicca has grown over time, and I think it's really important for anyone seeking Wicca, Gardnerian or otherwise, to understand that the broader landscape of paganism and the way that paganism thinks about things like gender has changed over time. The way that sort of broader society has changed over time in the way that we think about gender. and that's okay, and that's compatible with, you know, Gardnerian Wicca, where we worship a mother goddess and her horned god consort. Like, we can still have a nuanced and thoughtful discussion about gender and the way our ideas about gender have changed over time. And so I think that the way that Starhawk approaches that in the Spiral Dance, in the 20th anniversary edition, is really lovely and worth reading, just to think about the way that Starhawk changed her ideas and updated over time, and the way that that sort of applies to the broader pagan community and how we're all engaged in a similar conversation. So, good God, this is a long video. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We're almost done. I'm gonna wrap up soon, I promise. My last recommendation is, I don't have a fancy cover for it, but Witchcraft for Tomorrow by Doreen Valiente. Doreen Valiente, right, was commonly known as the mother of modern witchcraft. She was one of Gardner's early high priestesses, and she was incredibly influential. She wrote a lot of Wiccan liturgy. She dramatically shaped the Gardnerian tradition, and not just the Gardnerian tradition, but also other kinds of witchcraft that came after. So she was involved with Robert Cochrane, and you can see Doreen's fingerprints all over Cochranian witchcraft. She was just, like, incredibly influential in Wicca and in paganism more broadly, and she's a wonderful writer. So Witchcraft for Tomorrow is just a really lovely book about Wicca, about sort of the gods in Wicca, the way that the Sabbats work, the Wheel of the Year. She talks about the magic circle. She talks about Wiccan tools. She talks about divination and sort of the debate between working skyclad and working either robed or in street clothes. She also has sort of the second half of this book is a sample book of shadows, where she has rituals that she wrote for how to cast a circle and how to call the quarters and, you know, how to cast certain simple spells. And so for anyone who's looking to get started, who is sort of newer to Wicca, this is a really good starting place. This is honestly like one of the better Wicca 101 books out there. There's a little bit of outdated history in here. That's no surprise, because this book was written, when was this written? In 1978. But there's just really good information in there, and you're getting it straight from the horse's mouth, right? She is one of the people who shaped Wicca into what it is today. And so hearing her views about sort of who the gods are and what the deal is with the circle and why we work in a circle and how you call the quarters and things like that, it's just so important. And it's a really lovely, informative, clearly written book. It's an easy read. It's a pleasant read. I still refer back to it from time to time. She also, right, is definitive on the pronunciation of the word athame. I pronounce it wrong. I pronounce it athame because that's just sort of, I live in New Jersey. I say Wiccan words with a New Jersey accent. But Doreen Valiente, who is authoritative on this sort of thing, says athame. And so if you're looking for the definitive pronunciation of the name of the witch's dagger, it is athame. That said, you know, in the words of Isaac Bonowitz, athame, it's all athame to me. So that's my last recommendation. Those are my 13 books as recommendations for Gardnerian seekers. In hindsight, 13 was probably too many for a YouTube video, but it was like a witchy number, and it also happens to be the number of books on my recommended reading list. As a bonus, 14th book, if you are looking for more Wiccan goodness, my book, Kabbalah for Wiccans, Ceremonial Magic on the Pagan Path, is coming out from Llewellyn this December. It is an introductory Kabbalah book written for a Wiccan audience, so it's designed to explain Golden Dawn-style Hermetic Kabbalah in a way that feels more approachable and accessible to pagans, and shows sort of what Kabbalah is, but also how and why it might be relevant to a Wiccan practice, why it might be interesting and useful. Because I think a lot of Wiccans sort of have this feeling that, like, Kabbalah is all well and good, but it doesn't have much to do with the kind of magic that they practice. And so the book shows a little bit of the influence of Kabbalah on sort of Wiccan ritual structure, but also it talks about how these Kabbalistic concepts might be relevant and why Kabbalah, I think, is worth our time as Wiccans to study. it is also as much a Wicca book as it is a Kabbalah book. So it has some sample rituals in it. It has some discussion of things like casting a circle, using magical names, calling the quarters, cakes and wine, as well as some discussion of the gods. So if you're looking to learn about Wicca as well, you know, I'm biased because I wrote it, but I think it's a really good resource for that. It's coming out, like I say, from Llewellyn, December 2021. I will put a link in the description of the video below. But, you know, I wrote the book about Wicca and made a point to make it accessible for all kinds of Wicca, but also I am a Gardnerian. Gardnerian Wicca is the kind of Wicca that I know, and so the perspective on Wicca that you get in that book is going to be influenced by British traditional witchcraft. And so if you're looking for sort of books by Gardnerian authors, books that will give you a bit of a perspective on how some Gardnerians think about things, I highly recommend my own book. We're going to leave it off there because we are over 40 minutes, and that is just a very long video, and most people stop watching my videos after 6 minutes, so I don't expect anyone to watch all this all the way through. If you stuck with me, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and I will see you all soon.